Welcome to the Eonics Podcast, a podcast about software development, new ways of working, and lots of other interesting stuff.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I have my returning guest, Yatish Porwal. Welcome.
Thank you.
And last time I asked you if you had another interesting topic we could discuss in the future, and you told me about, I have to do a sneak peek, domain-first development approach.
Yeah.
This was a totally new subject to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit like on the architecture side, right?
It is an architectural design pattern.
An architectural design pattern. So what is domain-first development approach? Can you introduce us to it?
Sure. So yeah, if you think about it, right? Let's say take an example of a bank. Then in the bank, what happens is you have individuals who bank regularly, and then you have organizations where like people work, or organization as an entity, right? And then you have a relationship between that, individual is a legal representative of that particular organization. So the domain basically means like this is in a very small way, it's a domain, right? There's an individual, there's an organization, and there's a relationship between those two. Now, if you think about it, if you are creating some features only for individual or organization, then you have to think about it like what happens to that relationship. For example, that you have an organization and you have an individual, and you have a relationship between those two. And let's say the individual is deceased. Now he died, right?
Okay.
So then somebody will come to the bank and say this individual is no more. So before you delete that individual from your database or from your system, you have to think about it whether there are entities related to that individual exist or not. So right. if you don't do that, and in the software development, people just work on their approach, saying that somebody wants to close this individual or delete this individual, I just delete it and I'm done. But they have to think about it. What is the implication of it?
So talking about the domain is like keeping the whole picture in mind of the domain you are working in.
Exactly.
In this case, a bank.
Yeah.
And why is this necessary? Because people often only, when implementing features, focus on their...
Yeah, they only focus on what is required to complete that particular feature.
Specific feature.
That
right.
specific
So maybe
feature.
they develop a feature for an organization, but they don't take into account other parts of the domain.
Right. What is the implication? And then what happens is the domain data or the data in the system becomes inconsistent, and there is a kind of a relationship that is hanging over there without an individual. Right. So that's a bad data. Somebody wants to get that relationship. They cannot get the relationship because they cannot get the individual assigned with that, right? So it's just a bad data. And with my experience in the current project with a big bank that I'm working with, this was a big concern that there's a lot of bad data in the system, and we have to develop our software to just take care of it. The user should not get unexpected error. Because the data is bad. So you have to do a lot of defensive programming to cater to that, right? And it's not a good way of writing a software. Then we looked at a different approach to create a domain-first model and make sure that all the validations or the constraints are in the domain, and you cannot create an object if it is not valid.
So is that how you bring it in practice? You start to define the domain first?
Yes.
Before you
write any exposing service to your customer, first you work on the domain.
So what does that look like? Is it like database schemas or is it more on a documentation level?
No, it is actually a piece of code. So in the architecture pattern, what we do is we create multiple layers. Now there's an N-tier architecture where you have your exposing service to the consumer as one layer, and then the next layer is to do some validation on the request that is coming from the consumer.
Okay.
And then after all that validation is done, then you come to the domain layer where you see, okay, now all the data that I have received from the request is all fine. Now let me apply it to the domain, whether it complies to my domain or not.
Okay.
That's where so first you design the domain layer, then you go the service layer or the exposing layer or the database layer. So that's how it gets connected.
So you start from the conceptual domain.
Exactly.
First.
So domain first, and test your domain first before you test anything or write any other code.
Right. So, but how does that work in practice then? If I start developing a feature in a different part of the organization and I have to do this domain first approach?
Yeah.
Like how does my day-to-day job then change as a developer?
Well, you just need to have a paradigm shift that, you have to start, for example, if I take an example of like an onion, right? So generally people start from the peeling it off from the outside and then go inside. But
right.
Here you have to do a different approach. You have to start with a smaller portion first, which is a domain one, and then you expand it from the outside.
Okay, so if a new feature request comes in, you first look at the implication it has within the context of the model before you develop
before you expose it or before you develop any services or any database layer, you first look what your domain is, what are the validation, what are the constraint, where it impacts, and all that stuff, and before you develop.
But let's say the domain has been defined, right?
Yeah.
So we have defined how the bank works, what the entities are.
Yeah.
Like then, if someone comes with a feature request, how would that is the handling of that feature request then different than in a traditional approach?
Well, in the entire approach, depending upon the team, but generally people would like to, start from the exposing the service towards the consumer side, right? So they start from there and they say, okay, this is my input. I validate all that input. I do the security thing. And then you go layer the down layer and say now I have to store this database and then do the constraint in between. Right. But in this domain first approach, you forget about all the layers.
Okay.
You first focus on that, if this data is coming to me, whether it fits into my model or not.
Okay.
Right. And if it doesn't fit into the model, what kind of errors I need to return. So you write that code first, you test that code independently, that it doesn't matter where the request is coming from. So you test that and you make your domain solid as a rock. And then you work towards now my domain is fine. These objects are these are valid objects. Now we can store it into a database. We can retrieve it, send it back to the customer.
Right. So instead of working straight from the endpoint, you look at the domain first.
Right.
And what I'm also wondering is, in reality, like in a big organization like a bank, it seems like it would be very hard to start doing this approach when there's so much other stuff around which doesn't work like that, if you know what I mean. Is it something you can only do when you start from the ground up, or is it something you can actually do in an existing environment as well?
You can do it in the existing environment. You need to build little building blocks first, right? In the bank that I'm working right now, there's a team who build this all the building blocks, right? The smallest thing that you need to build, this is a valid object, the smallest the object which is valid, and then created a bigger object and the bigger object, and then say, for example, for an individual, right? Let's take an example. For an individual, the country has to be a valid country.
Right.
And then it has to have a valid name, right? It has to have, let's say, 36 characters in a first name and the last name, right? So if you have more than that, you cannot accept it. That's not a valid object. So it will not create that object. It will say the first name is a valid, it has to be there. You cannot create an individual without a first name. So these are the validations. So you create your building blocks initially. That should be a part of it, right? To create any feature. So that's where you have to start from, and then go a little bit higher up.
So does that mean in practice that you start detecting a lot of data in your existing systems that doesn't conform
Sorry, what
to
was
the domain? Well, if you start doing this, maybe in an existing environment, you will discover that a lot of the data you already have is not conforming to the domain, right?
Yeah. So that's the challenge, right? That the data would not be compliant to that. Then you when you run your domain first, then you will see like this data is not compliant. Either you say like you correct the data because that's the way to do it, right? Because
there's no simple trick, of course.
No, there's no simple trick. And that's the way the bank works because the data is not correct according to the bank.
Okay, and in what kind of situation would you say would you apply this architecture? Like, what are the situations in which this is a really useful way to architect your development approach?
I think this domain first can be applied almost all the places, but especially where things are complicated, like the functioning at the bank, there are many things that go hand in hand, and they are not in the silo. So that's where you need this approach, right? Because one feature change or change request can make a big impact in the bank functionality other places, right? So that's where when there's a good amount of dependency, a lot of dependency, that's where you use this approach is very useful, I would say.
Right.
Yeah.
And if someone would want to experiment with it themselves, just in a smaller context, what would you advise to do? Is there like a certain resource they can look up, or should they just experiment? How do you actually go about making your domain or defining your domain? So to define your domain, basically you need to create all those entities, right? What are your basic building blocks? Like for example, let's say you are creating a order management system, right? So then you create like what consists of an order, what is a customer, how your item looks like, right? So you create all those basic entities, and you say these things has to be there in an order, and it has to be there in the item. Right.
Yeah. So then you create that model. So you create those entities, you create this constraint, and then start building on that.
And then from that point onwards, anything that enters the domain has to conform to that,
right?
I see. Yeah. So that can still actually be done in a smaller project.
It can be done. It can be done. Yeah, it can be applied anywhere, and this is in my experience, it's a much better approach where your impact to the system, and the moment you start growing bigger in your company, and that's where things go out of their hand, right? I mean, the people don't know what is the impact of this feature change to the entire the software that they have or the system they have, and that's what people struggle a lot, because not everybody has a complete view of the how functioning is going in this company, right?
Yeah. It's almost also like especially in a bigger complex situation, I can imagine a clear definition of the domain also really helps to harmonize across teams, just because the definition of the domain creates also a common understanding.
That's true, right?
Of the whole organizational picture in people's minds. Like, okay, even though I'm working on this small feature here, like there's this whole other world,
right?
That I need to think about.
You need to think about it, and it's not just on the paper; it's actually written in the code.
Right.
So if you try to create an entity which is not valid, it will not allow you to do it. Exactly. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's also you can also really enforce
that. Yes.
Enforce that.
Yeah.
Interesting. And are there specific like technologies or frameworks to work with this, or is it more like how do you say, like a best practice and a development approach, or is there specific technologies that are relevant?
Well, you can use any language per se. I'm more familiar with Java, and I'm working in Java environment, so we use Java most of the time. But I think it is language agnostic.
Okay.
Yeah, you don't need to stick to a particular language. It is, as I said, it's a architectural design pattern, not a specific implementation in a framework or a language.
So it's all about doing the domain definition and then keeping it consistent in the code, and not allowing the anything that's not conforming to the domain to be entered into the system.
Exactly.
That's kind of the basic idea.
Yeah. In the other paradigm where we work, like, in the way the software development happens in general, the functional requirements are written somewhere, and then a software developer actually writes that code to make that requirement. But the domain is not very clear, like that what will happen if these things change. Right. So so
it's like going from requirement, instead of working like how do you say? Yeah, like you said with the onion, instead of, or maybe you can think of a tree, instead of working from the leaves, which are the requirements, you work more from the core and like the domain of what the tree actually looks like.
Exactly.
With the
from
trunk
the root and the trunk.
The
exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything more to say about this, or do you think we covered it?
I think I would like to say that it is a paradigm shift. So all the developers who are interested in domain first and they want to look at it, it's more of a conceptual. They have to put in their mind first before they put into the code, because that's a paradigm shift, right? I would say just to give an analogy is. Before the object-oriented programming came into light, it was all procedural programming.
Right.
And people who loved procedural programming, they said, why do I need to go to the object-oriented programming, and what's the benefit? But once you get adopted to it, and then you say, there are benefits to the object-oriented programming. I can do a reuse, I can do a encapsulation, abstraction, and everything, right? So similarly, it took little while for people to convert from procedural to object-oriented programming. And that's what I would say, going from N-tier architecture to look into this domain first, designing this one, because when you're designing domain first, you have nothing else to test from consumer side. Right. There's no endpoint. There's nothing. There's no connection over there, and that's where people find it difficult. How do I test it? So you have to write your scenarios and test, and be it a unit test or kind of a scenario test, which scenarios in the sense from a business perspective, this is my domain and this object should be validated. Right? Or if it is not validated, then it should throw an error. So I think that's a paradigm shift that people need to keep in mind. Yeah, you often think as a developer from the user perspective, the interactions that the user can do. Right. And this is kind of the total opposite of that in a way. It is coming from inside to the outside rather than outside to inside. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Yatish, for sharing your knowledge. Yeah. Thank you for having me. And I hope in the future you can share some more. Absolutely. Anytime. Okay. Thank you so much. Bye. Thank you, Marcus.